Let me ask both of you about this. We're talking about 1848, and we're talking about his presidential years in the 1860s. But many of the same players were in both camps at both times. So it was quite a patchwork of political, what can I say, ideas, I guess, that were going around, both North and South, and there were on both sides a lot of infighting. Could you, each of you, talk about some of the players that were there and the factions, really? What were the various factions that were out there in both the North and the South? Chris, why don't you start this?
Sure. Well, you basically have four positions in the Congress on the issue of slavery. So you're looking at, and Lincoln was always in the most extreme in his corner. So the idea that he was for the Wilmot Proviso, no expansion of slavery into the territories gained by Mexico, no expansion of slavery outside of where it exists. And in between that, you had the idea that later became known as popular sovereignty. Every state would decide, the territories would decide how they wanted to be organized, if they'd be free or slave. In the third category, which President Polk ascribed to, we were just going to draw the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific Ocean. And we're just going to, this line has worked for us, we're going to keep it. And then on the far side of it, of course, you have the belief that's later codified in the Dred Scott decision, which is that you can't ban slavery from the territories, that people have a right to take their property where they want to. And so you have these four positions, and the parties, which is interesting, in this era, the parties are unorganized North and South. Lincoln has colleagues in the South. I think I'm most interested by his relationship with Alexander Stephens, who subsequently becomes vice president of the Confederacy. Stephens would later say that he was probably his best friend in the House, maybe besides Mr. Toombs. So that they were so close together, and that they worked, they were
both against the war.
Both against the war, but I think most importantly, Mexican-American War. They were in a group of seven called the Young Indians. They were the first supporters of Zachary Taylor's bid for the presidency in Congress, and so they both worked very hard for his nomination for the presidency, which was no easy feat. He'd never voted, nobody knew where he stood on issues, but Lincoln and Stephens both smelled a winner, and so he was part of a group that sought to nominate him, and he serves with John Quincy Adams for a couple months, the only link really between Lincoln and the Founding Fathers. In John Quincy Adams. And so he serves with many of the people who would later end up becoming very significant during the Civil War.
John, who was there back in your day in 48? Same divisions?
You're putting me on the spot here. I don't want to dodge the question, but what's interesting is, in a way, there's a lot of history, again, no pun intended, with all of these people, and yet the war changes everything. And so, in a sense, they can draw upon these personal histories, and there's a lot of baggage, as it were. But then, once the war starts, all of that almost has to be, in many respects, forgotten. But Lincoln does sit down with Stephens, at the famous conference toward the end of the war, again, which Spielberg depicts. And you have to wonder, what was going through their minds. We don't have any records of what was actually said. Nobody was really taking notes. But these are two guys who've known each other for a long time, and yet since the last time they had met, it's an entirely different universe. And I think that Spielberg again, I think does this pretty well. But maybe Stephens is trying to draw upon that. And Lincoln's not having really any of it. He's perfectly willing to be civil, but there's no way that they're going to talk about anything substance.
Yeah, they actually end up cracking jokes. Right. So Stephens is a diminutive little man, and he's wearing this giant coat.
Not big enough in the film, by the way.
Yeah, and so when Stephens shows up, it's the first time Abraham Lincoln has seen them since they parted ways in 1849. And he says, "I've never seen such a small man come outside of such a gigantic nub." So because he's got all these clothes around. And then, interestingly, Stephens relays this story to Lincoln aboard the River Queen during the Hampton Roads Conference. He says, "Do you remember when we were on the floor and the Illinois delegation was fighting over how you say the word Illinois? And is it Illinois? Was it Illinois? Something people to this day sometimes can't figure out. And they brought in John Quincy Adams. They said, let's bring in the former president to come decide this. And he says, well, if I had to judge based on this delegation, I'd say the pronunciation is all noise. And so that was something that Stevens reminded Lincoln of. So there was some reminiscing of their days as members of Congress.
Were there a number of reminiscences of Lincoln? You mentioned a few of them earlier on that came out after the assassination and later on or even during his presidency for that matter, remembering him in Congress that they talked about in letters or diaries, whatever.
Yeah, quite a few. Obviously, there's the Giddings diary, which I think everybody's used, which was, Joshua Giddings is somebody who's very unheralded in the present day. Mm-hmm. But even when he lived alongside John Quincy Adams, he was still considered perhaps the greatest abolitionist in the country. And so he's someone who really hasn't gotten his due, if for no other reason than the incredible impact he had on his housemate, Abraham Lincoln, when they served together. But a number of his colleagues wrote memoirs, they wrote autobiographies, and they, of course, never failed to mention their most famous colleague, Abraham Lincoln. So it was neat to read it from their perspective.
In regard to the presidency, Lincoln famously said that he had the taste in his mouth a little. When did that taste begin for Congress?
Birth. So the first chapter in my book is called "The Most Ambitious Man in the World." And because today we tend to think of ambition as being a bad thing, if somebody seeks to serve in political office and they've got ambition, well, that's just a bad thing. And so we assume Lincoln must not have been ambitious, but surely they just carried him to the presidency without him ever having to get dirty in politics. Nothing could be further from the truth. When he was a little boy, he was misbehaving, and his older sister chastised him. She said, "If you keep misbehaving like this, what do you think you're going to become in life?" And he said, "President of the United States." People who grew up with him, a cousin who grew up with him said Abe was just always awful hungry to be somebody. And
what was his strategy to get there?
To get to Congress.
Yes.
Well, so he'd served as a legislator. He had to run against two people who were almost identical to him, at least in terms of biography, right? You've got John Hardin and Edward Baker, who he named his son after, and who was a very dear friend of his. And they were both lawyers. They were both state legislators. And so Lincoln's strategy is to try to, every county was going to have a convention before going to this larger convention, and they'd pick the Whig nominee. And if you're a Whig in Illinois, then as now the state's dominated by Democrats. So if you're an ambitious Whig, this congressional seat is your only ticket into some kind of higher office. You're never going to be governor.
Nominating conventions were very new at that time, were they not? The Whigs, it was the first one they'd had.
They were, and Lincoln was a huge proponent of conventions. He said, if the Democrats are going to do it, we got to fight fire with fire. Because back then, if you couldn't winnow out the field to just one Whig and you're running against one Democrat, you're going to lose.
It was held in Baltimore?
What's that? The first Democratic convention was, to nominate Martin Van Buren for the vice presidency and to renominate Jackson.
Right. And the Whigs met?
The Whigs met. Unfortunately, Lincoln loses to Baker in the Sangamon County Convention. And his wife chastises him. She says, "You could have worked so much harder at this." One of the Register, at any rate, reported that if Lincoln hadn't thrown in the towel so early in the day, that there were delegates showing up later who would have supported him, maybe put him over the top. Instead, he loses to Baker. Baker goes on to face Hardin in the final round. He loses to Hardin. Lincoln gets sent there as a delegate, which he remarks is like being cut out. You got a guy who steals your woman and then asks you to stand up in the wedding. So he has to go there as a pledged delegate for Baker.
Now, you're a political strategist. What would you have advised Lincoln to have done? He won, of course, after all, eventually. He got in there. But would you have said something to him that said, this is what you might want to try?
Abraham Lincoln came up with a strategy to ultimately win this congressional seat that I'm not sure any modern political strategist could have thought of. So what he figures out, he says, okay, Hardin's younger than me. He's going to get to Congress. He's going to be there forever. We get to this final convention where he and Baker are separated by a very small margin. So he says there's a lot of support in the room for Baker, but Hardin gets the nomination. So he introduces a resolution that says, we congratulate Mr. Hardin on his victory. We also recommend Mr. Baker as the congressman in 2 years, effectively cutting short Hardin's career in Congress before he ever texts
and his own later on.
Eventually, lived by the sword, died by the sword. But ultimately, Hardin, even before he's elected, says this will be my only term. Baker gets in. Baker understands the score. He steps aside for Lincoln. Hardin, of course, who's never really a party to this, threatens to run against Lincoln again in 1846, and Lincoln brilliantly sort of co-opts him by locking down all this support before Hardin even thought to run again. But that's what paves the way for him, and the door is closing on him, and he manages to get his boot in it just in time.
And he never took anything personally.
No.
It was never personal, and so if he lost out, if he
Yeah.
felt slighted, he's not going to hold a grudge because
Yeah.
he's thinking of the long term.
Sounds like the
And what-
mafia is just business.
Yeah.
Well, he's able. No, he doesn't take it. All the times that he's been insulted by
Yeah.
one person or another, and it's all business, and he's willing to do that if that's what the party needs.
Yeah.
And that's what he's willing to do to
Although-
achieve that goal.
Although I will say a very, very rare display of pettiness on behalf of Lincoln's part takes place during this time where he actually withholds his vote from Hardin. So he votes for all the county people, but he doesn't vote for Hardin for Congress.
Yeah. Interesting. And that was Mary Lincoln's cousin.
Yeah,
John
the
Hardin.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Kentucky royalty.
Yeah. John, you're in a book on Reconstruction, and you wish to expand that definition. You alluded to it before, what the definition of Reconstruction really is. Give us what you think about Reconstruction, what it is, and what role, I'm going to broaden this now, what Emancipation Proclamation brought to Lincoln's view of Reconstruction as well.
I was just about to say, can I talk about Lincoln's definition of Reconstruction?
Please.
Because in a nutshell, what the book tries to do is show how Lincoln, in effect, had to rethink, reconceptualize what Reconstruction is. Lincoln is thinking about the question that we know of Reconstruction from the very beginning of the war. It's not, he doesn't start thinking about it in 1863 when he issues his 10% plan. He doesn't start thinking about it when it's like, whoa, you know what, we might actually win this thing. Maybe I should start thinking about a post-war plan. From the very beginning, he's thinking about, he becomes president and the country's falling apart. So he's got to think about putting it back together.
Yeah, this is not theory, this is actual practice.
Right, and he always said that, this is a practical problem. But for Lincoln, at the beginning, it's really more restoration. It's about restoring the old Union. No real fundamental changes in terms of the social and economic and political relationships and institutions in the South or in the nation at large. It's a very limited view of Reconstruction in much the same way it's a very limited view of the war. The war is going to be over quickly, it won't require a lot of bloodletting, it won't require massive changes. As we all know, that's a well-known story, that gets reconfigured. How Lincoln comes to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, redefine the war. Well, part of this whole equation is his thinking of Reconstruction. If he was thinking really about restoration at the beginning, by the end of the war, he really is thinking about, and he has begun to think seriously about fundamental social, political, and economic change in the South and the Union at large. Now, I hasten to say he doesn't have this figured out, okay? But he's at least begun to think seriously about these issues and to begin to incorporate what that will mean for Southern society, for African Americans, and for American democracy. So by the end of the war, he really is thinking about serious Reconstruction. Now, where things get a little bit more complicated is that there are still elements of his restorationist rhetoric and thinking that kind of continue on. When he uses, terms like, restoring the practical relations between the states and the national government, and in certain other things, he's still using what seems like restorationist language. So in a way, there's a kind of tension. I don't think Lincoln is entirely aware of this, but there's almost kind of a tension during the second half of the war between this kind of restorationist mentality and this more genuine Reconstruction. And so I think those scholars who have focused on Lincoln as kind of more conservative, as thinking about restoration and not really thinking about a fundamental reconstruction of Southern society, I think they've been maybe misled a little bit by some of the restorationist terminology and rhetoric that Lincoln is using. Because certainly after the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and there are any number of instances of this, the new birth of freedom, in the Gettysburg Address, and any number of other speeches and writings, he is clearly thinking seriously about what freedom will mean, particularly for the former slaves. And that it's not just going to be about letting the South off easily. It's not going to be about leniency toward the ex-Confederates, that the post-war order is going to require some kind of justice for the former slaves.
Of course, he put war and Reconstruction together during the war, and it was linked, and then he had to try to get away from that a little bit, because then he had to look at what's going to happen at the rest of his administration. and how he's going to then socialize the South. Did he feel that he actually could perhaps change some of Southern society in this regard? He was talking at the end about blacks as an entity, as a political entity, and maybe having some limited suffrage. He was thinking about these things near the end, and he had to get away from the war part of this and toward a societal view that would change.
That's the beauty of this. Where are we going to go once the war, is finally over?
He gave intimations in the second inaugural.
Absolutely. We all know about, with malice toward none, right? That he's going to be lenient. But if you follow the wording of that last paragraph, he says, we have to finish the work that we're doing. The work that we're doing, take care of the orphans, the widows, etc. But it also says we have to work toward a just and a lasting peace. A just and lasting peace. And for somebody who chose his words as carefully as he did, right, he's making a clear statement about what the post-war order is going to look like. Now again, he doesn't have this figured out, but he's at least begun to think substantively about what is this going to require.